You know that person. Everyone else from school scattered. Different cities, different states, different opportunities, different lives. At least, that's how it looked. And they stayed. Same hometown. Sometimes the same neighborhood. Sometimes the same street. People eventually started asking questions. Didn't you ever want more? Didn't you want to see what was out there? Didn't you think about leaving? And they never seemed to have a great answer. Not because there wasn't one. Because the real answer wasn't something you could explain at 25. It wasn't even something you could fully understand at 40. It took decades to reveal itself. For most of our lives, we're taught a very specific lesson. If you want to grow, leave. If you want opportunity, leave. If you want success, leave. The message is everywhere. The people who leave are ambitious. The people who stay are settling. At least, that's the story we've been told. But what if one of the biggest assumptions of modern life is wrong? What if the people who stayed weren't avoiding growth? What if they were building something that becomes more valuable with every passing decade? Because if you still live in your hometown today, psychology suggests it may say a lot more about you than most people realize. And to understand why, we need to talk about something society gets completely wrong. Modern career advice treats geography like destiny. Move where the jobs are. Move where the money is. Move where the opportunities are. And there's nothing wrong with that. Millions of people leave home and build wonderful lives. This isn't a story about why leaving was a mistake. It's a story about what staying built. Research consistently shows that most adults actually live surprisingly close to where they grew up. Not a small minority. Most. Which immediately raises an interesting question. If so many people stay close to home, why do we keep treating it like failure? Part of the answer comes from understanding how human beings evolved. For most of history, people didn't move hundreds or thousands of miles away. They lived in small communities, the same families, the same neighbors, the same familiar faces. Relationships weren't built through apps, and they weren't maintained through video calls. They required physical proximity, time together, years together, sometimes entire lifetimes together. And those relationships had a strange quality. They compounded. A friendship that lasts 30 years isn't 3 times stronger than a friendship that lasts 10. It's something entirely different. Trust compounds. Shared memories compound. Reliability compounds. The longer people stayed, the more valuable those relationships became, which means every time someone left, they weren't simply moving. They were restarting the compounding process from zero. New town, new neighbors, new friendships, new reputation, new support system. The people who stayed weren't avoiding growth, they were protecting something that growth elsewhere would have required abandoning. And that brings us to one of the most important concepts in this entire conversation: social capital. Social scientists have spent decades studying it. Social capital is the network of relationships that provides trust, support, information, and belonging within a community. And research consistently links strong social ties to better mental health, greater life satisfaction, and higher levels of well-being. But social capital sounds abstract. So let's make it real. It's the neighbor who notices when your car hasn't moved in 3 days. It's the friend who has known you since high school. It's the local business owner who remembers your parents. It's the person who shows up at your door when life falls apart, not because they have to, but because they know you. The person who never left their hometown wasn't just living somewhere familiar. They were spending decades building a network of trust, layer upon layer, year after year. Most people never notice this while it's happening, because it feels normal, until they need it. Then, suddenly, they realize how valuable it is. Because social capital is one of the few things in life that cannot be purchased, it cannot be accelerated, and it cannot be downloaded overnight. It takes time. Sometimes, an entire lifetime. But even social capital isn't the most valuable thing staying creates. There's something deeper, something harder to measure, something that may be disappearing in modern life. Identity. Think about walking through your hometown today. Not the buildings, not the roads, the memories, the corner where you used to meet friends, the school where you spent your teenage years, the house where someone important once lived, the park where your children played, the restaurant where you celebrated milestones. To everyone else, they're just locations. To you, they're chapters. When you've spent decades in the same place, your memories become attached to the physical world around you. Your life isn't stored only in photographs, it's embedded into the streets themselves. Psychologists have long understood that human beings need continuity. We need a sense that our lives form a coherent story. We need to feel connected to our past, and familiar places help provide that connection. The person who stayed didn't simply remain in one town, they remained connected to their own history. And in a world where everything seems to change faster every year, that continuity becomes surprisingly valuable. But even identity isn't the deepest thing staying provides. Because beneath social capital, beneath continuity, beneath familiar streets and familiar faces, there is something else. Something that psychologists repeatedly identify as one of the strongest human needs: belonging. Researchers who study happiness and well-being continue to arrive at the same conclusion: human beings need to belong. Not occasionally, not as a luxury, as a necessity. We need places where we are known, places where our story already exists, places where we don't have to constantly explain who we are. And for many people who stayed in their hometown, belonging wasn't something they spent decades searching for. It grew naturally. One conversation at a time, one friendship at a time, one familiar face at a time. The world often assumes that staying means missing out. But what if the opposite is sometimes true? What if staying allowed people to gain something many others spend years trying to rebuild? Because here's what often happens. The people who leave gain opportunities. The people who stay gain roots. The people who leave build careers. The people who stay build community. The people who leave create new beginnings. The people who stay create continuity. Neither choice is automatically better, but they are different. And modern culture spends far more time celebrating one than understanding the other. Maybe that's why people who stayed are so often misunderstood. Society sees what they didn't do. It rarely notices what they did. The decades of relationships, the trust, the community, the identity, the belonging, the invisible things that become more valuable with age, not less. Eventually, there comes a point in life when many people stop asking, "How far did I go?" and start asking, "Who knows my story? Who would help if I needed it? Where do I belong?" For many people who never left their hometown, those questions already have answers, not because they lacked ambition, not because they feared change, but because they spent a lifetime building something. Something slower, something quieter, something modern society often overlooks. The world looked at the person who stayed and wondered what they were missing. What it missed was what they had. Decades of relationships nobody can replicate overnight. A community that genuinely knows them. A history woven into the streets around them. A sense of belonging that took a lifetime to build. You didn't necessarily stay because you couldn't leave. You may have stayed because, somewhere deep down, you understood what staying would create. And after all these years, it created exactly that. If you still live in your hometown, tell me something. How long have you lived there? And what is one thing about staying that people who left often don't understand? I'd love to hear your story. I read every single comment.